Hello, my name is Zodian, and tonight we will speak about air power and change in war. This is the outline. So we have an introduction, main arguments from the text, which we will discuss, the case studies, definitions, debates, conceptual debate, the theories, and several historical cases: World War II, the Cold War, conventional war during the Cold War, and the recent debate about the decline of air power. This video is based on a strategic studies seminar that I taught several years ago, and I thank Professor Radu Kukuta for allowing me to use some of the sources. And the text of today is David MacIsaac chapter Voices from the Central Blue, the Air Power Theorist. This was published 40 years ago in Makers of Modern Strategy with Fifi, and which is basically an anthology, classical anthology written by mostly American scholars. I have chosen this old text because several of his main ideas are still useful today, as we will see. Okay, one way to illustrate the relevance of air power is to look at the current events. One example is news from Associated Press about the truce in Lebanon, and this is during for the war. So it's related to the war against Iran, which is mostly an air campaign. So the air power is important. The other news is about China, who's raises defense spending, so for with some 7% this year. This was decided in March in a conference of the Communist Party and Congress, and the amount is like 7%. So China is accelerated, is emphasizing this military modernization. A big part of this military modernization is about aircraft and missiles and UAVs and so on, which means that also for China, military air power is important. Okay. Now, the main arguments from the text. One is that air power is not very well conceptualized, so technology is more important than theories. Uh, this is not something specific to air power. We saw last time when speaking about Mahan, we saw that the practice of naval warfare was developed for thousands of years before Mahan come with this idea of sea power. And the debates on air power are basically inspired and sometimes they are analogous to the ones of from sea power. So what is new is this idea of actually strategic theory. Now, the concept of air power is not very well defined, and the organizations, the services from the technology, the weapons overlap, the system of weapons. And the further argument is there are recurring controversy about the effectiveness and the efficiency of air power, especially about the strategic version, as we will see. So some debates which were uttered after World War II are still important today when we speak about Iran. Now, the examples. World War II is basically the classical conflict in which air power proved its worth. There are also two other wars in which air power is considered to be very important: the 1967 war and the Kosovo War. And there are also a lot of modeled cases, for example, in a Korean War where air power was used, but alongside other types of combat, like ground combat, and the Iraq War, where air power was decisive, the shock and awe in the beginning, and but then asymmetric warfare became more important, and air power receded in the background. It was used, but in a supporting role. These are a few definitions. One is we see that there are three definitions for air power. One is like a new environment, air as a new environment for war. The other is the whole air capacity, which is not basically only planes but missiles and UAVs and so on, and cruise missiles. And the other is about the air force as a specific organization. These they overlap, but they are not identical. Now we see several four missions for goals for the air power: exploration, reconnaissance, which is basically to explore something; close air support, which is to act alongside ground or navies for their specific goals; air interdictions is to act against land and sea targets, but somehow farther from and not always in the support of ground forces. And the most ambitious mission is this strategic bombing. And strategic bombing is promises that you can win a war by air power alone, and you could do that to basically two means. One is you destroy the enemy's economy and infrastructure, and the enemy is forced to capitulate, and the other is basically you break the enemy's morale. Both approaches are you can see today in the Russo-Ukrainian war or in Iran. So these concepts actually, what they were defined somewhere after World War II, but they are still important for the air power. Now, the conceptual issues. MacIsaac argued that the influence of theories was small because the idea about air power, the practice of air power use was influenced more by practitioners and inventions than by theoreticians. So, a few examples of that are there's a terminological confusion between terms like air control, air command, air power, air support. This the air power strategy and air power is, let's say, independent or not independent, significant means of war has its origin in World War One. In World War One, there were zeppelins who were used for bombing, but also the first so some of the first examples of airplanes used in massive scale in war. There were cases of airplanes used before World War One, but in World War One, the utility, the use of airplanes was more important, more massive. In the beginning, they were used for reconnaissance, but then they were used for direct combat and also for bombardment. Close to the end of the war, the idea to combine tanks and airplanes was developed, but it was developed close to the end of the war, so the influence was not as high, as important as in World War II. Now, there are examples of theory. So this another Wagner argued that the domain was not very well theorized, and MacIsaac supports his conclusions. The most important theories was Giulio Due. Giulio Due is basically the father of strategic bombardment. He argued that the bomber, in combination with chemical weapons, or basically in combination with weapons of mass destruction, will win wars. So today we can imagine an equivalent is nuclear bombardment. The problem, what he didn't anticipate, was deterrence. What will happen when everybody will have, not everybody, but all the great powers will have strategic bombardment capacities. Nuclear deterrence shows that they kind of cancel each other. So nuclear deterrence or nuclear dissuasions make conventional, make war, great war, large scale war between great major actors less credible. So in a way, he was right in the sense that the combination between bombardment and weapons of mass destruction was important, but it kind of canceled itself. Was is so strong that you cannot really use it. In a, let's say, general meaning, in general war. There are two other theories. Billy Mitchell, who basically promoted all forms of air power, and he was a practitioner, and he did some tests to show that this air power is significant. In the beginning, many militaries were skeptical of the idea of making separate service for air power, and they are often integrated in, like in the navy or the army. And this was the case, for example, in the United States. And there's another guy, that's Seversky, who is considered by MacIsaac a popularizer. So, but these are the classical, the three, the way Mitchell and the Seversky are the classical theories of air power. World War II. Well, World War II showed that in practice, air power was used in for many tasks, which are basically these tasks. So reconnaissance, close air support, air interdiction. Also, they were used in naval combat by carriers and in strategic bombing. Okay, Brody is important was important strategies for especially for nuclear theory or nuclear strategy. And he argued that strategic bombing was an excess because it targeted the morale, the effects took too much time, the effects on morale are highly debatable. Often, strategic bombardment didn't broke the morale, it made people more stubborn, more willing to continue the fight. Also, it lacked precision and effectiveness. And this doctrine of strategic bombing led to the development of nuclear weapons, which are a major risk for humanity. Also, as we just spoke, there are other tasks for the air power, the air forces, which was air superiority, interdiction, direct support, and so on. The idea was that strategic bombing was exaggerated. During the Cold War, because of this combination between strategic bombardment and nuclear weapons, a lot of strategic thought was directed towards this new technology. So Bernard Brody was the father, another father of deterrence theory. His most important argument was that atomic weapons are too dangerous and too powerful, and therefore the goal of the militaries should be to deter each other and not to fight major conventional wars the- between great powers. Doesn't mean that the military won't have any use, but main use, the traditional main use for military force was to fight another great power. The definition of great power was it's a state who is able to fight all the other big states. So this function is undergoing change because of nuclear weapons. Another consequence of World War II and the first years of the Cold War was that the tactical air power was neglected. Like, for example, the fight between airplanes. It was neglected until the Vietnam War. Now, the Cold War was defined by this relation of nuclear deterrence and by the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, but there were also conventional wars. Sometimes the conventional wars were fought not by great powers but by regional or local or small or medium powers. And the 1967 war between Israel and the Arab states is an example. Israel won the war by using his air power against, for example, the Egypt Air Force. And it's one of examples in which air power was decisive, but the problem with the 1967 war was the war wasn't decisive. It took another war just to arrive at some peace between Egypt and Israel, and the wider Middle Eastern conflict is going on even today. So the 1967 war was the war in which Israel took control of Cisjordania and Gaza, and the problem is still actual today. Other types of conflicts were asymmetric, like especially for the war in Vietnam, emphasized by MacIsaac and not just by MacIsaac. And in the Vietnam War, the autonomous use of air power, like for example, against North Vietnam, it failed. It was designed to push North Vietnam to make concessions. So while North Vietnam makes some concessions, in the end, when the U.S. troops withdrew, the North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam, so it didn't respect the promises. And other uses of air power were to support, for example, the helicopters that we used to transport the troops, and so on. But because the specific form of guerrilla warfare is to avoid open conflict, the air power was less useful or less decisive than in the 1967 war. There were also factors or changes. For example, the air defense made progress, and this was seen in the 1973 war when Egypt advanced in Sinai alongside the air defense. So the air defense moved with the troops, and it was more difficult for Israel to use its air power the same way it was used in 1967 war. And also there were new technologies like overall missiles, cruise missiles, and the UAVs, which meant that manned aircraft, or which were the base of air forces as independent services, so manned aircraft declined in importance. So, alongside manned aircraft, there are different forms of, let's say, air technologies. And so this led to a thesis by Martin van Creveld. Martin van Creveld is an important Israeli military historian and sometimes strategist. And he wrote a book called The Age of Air Power, published 15 years ago. Now, Israel is one of the countries who was inventing the use of air power, manned airplanes, but also is one of the first countries which developed drones, and he has an expertise in let's say bombardment. So he argued that Martin van Creveld argued that air power is less important due to a combination of factors. One is the one we mentioned before, that nuclear deterrence inhibits conventional war between great powers. That means that while strategic bombardment is a threat which is used in deterrence, it's not an actuality. It doesn't happen. It's just a threat. So you don't see wide scale uses of air power between major actors. Also, the cost of aircraft has risen, and while the number of airplanes has greatly decreased, which means that sometimes during the World War II, in 1 year, United States was producing somewhere around 100,000 airplanes per year, and now the order of produce the order of number is very much smaller. There are other reasons. If you compare the rhythm of technological progress for manned airplanes, is much slower now than during World War One and the 1950s. 1950s, jet airplanes become widespread. So, what he mean by that is that something similar to drones happened during World War One and the 1950s. So, the weapon of today was obsolete in a few months. This doesn't happen. Sometimes old platforms like B-52 are still used, and the gains in precision are overstated, which means that fighter bombers or dive bombers in World War II were also very precise. And what happened with let's say precision guided missiles was that you can actually bomb from much higher altitudes from above than in World War II, but the precision was somehow similar. He also argued that because of the costs, aircraft are too expensive to be used against a, let's say, competent enemy, which means an enemy who has a very strong air defense. So they are risky, and therefore there were other types of aircraft are used, like missiles and the UAVs. The problem here is that if missiles and UAVs go alongside the manned aircraft, the question is whether you actually need an independent air power, and this is the question which Van Crevel rises. So it's not the decline of air power in the sense that air power doesn't matter, it's the decline of air power as something autonomous. It's actually analogous to this discussion of Mahan. Sea power is still important, but the idea that you can win the war only by sea power, for example, by blockade, is controversial. Another limit is that they are not air power is not decisive in asymmetric wars. And for a combination of moral and let's say operational reasons, and as we discussed earlier, guerrillas and terrorists actually hide, so air power is less important. Also, there were historical analogies for Van Creveld when a technology or a form of combat becomes too costly and too restricted, is on the verge of decline. And he uses here the examples of ships with war ships during the antiquity, which started from, let's say, for around one row to, let's say, 10 rows, and the Hellenic in the Hellenic period, and this was very close to the situation where they become basically obsolete. Another example is armor knights. As time went by and the technology progressed, armor became more and more heavy and more, let's say, decorated and so on, and more artistic, and more for show. And when the armor was like, for example, you see in Game of Thrones, and when people had armors like that, it was very close to the period when armor declined. Armor knights declined in utility. And the last example is from battleships. So battleships become more heavier and more armored. For example, in the interwar period in World War II, and when they were basically replaced by carriers. So there's a lot of debate whether air power in the way we got used with it during, for example, World War II, and the way it's taught by often by decision makers is still as important today as it was in the past. But the main conclusion is that air power is still important even in this course, so we must speak about it. It's also important in operations, as is witnessed by the Russo-Ukrainian war and by the wars in Middle East. What is debated is the refinements. How important is air power, and whether is it can win wars alone? Most people argue that no, air power should be used in a combined way with other forms of warfare. The pinnacle of air power strategy was the theory of Douai, the theory of strategic bombing, the idea that you can win war just by air power alone, hitting the enemy morale or hitting the enemy economy and technology infrastructure. This doesn't work very well or very fast. There are a few examples like the war in Kosovo or the 1967 war when air power was highly important, decisive, and so on. But the discussion is whether this is true in general, because you can bring specific reasons why this wars ended up so fast. So even if this idea of strategic bombing is criticized by scholars, the hope of winning wars by the independent use of air power is much alive today, as it was seen in the campaign against Iran. The campaign against Iran in the end today is in some type of negotiation. You see, it was mostly an air campaign, but now it becomes an air and sea campaign with several ground forces which are gathered as a way to pressure or maybe a way to extend the war. So we will see. But the idea is only the bombardment wasn't enough. Now, this doesn't mean that air power is useless. It means that it's a tool alongside other tools. This is the idea of combined arms. Now, the debates. There are several debate issues we saw. One is the meaning of air power, and the meaning of air power is related to other ideas, whether command of the air is still a useful idea. For example, if you hit the enemy's airplanes, the enemy can still have missiles and UAVs and so on. So it's not just a military concept; it's not that simple. The other is the perspective of manned aircraft, whether the manned aircraft will be replaced by new technologies, or they will go each with its own function. The fourth issue to debate, which is this impact of new technologies, especially drones, warm drones, and so on. But there are also other possibilities. And the last issue is whether we should be more modest and think in terms of combined arms and avoid highly ambitious let's say, strategies.